All right, this is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet with Captain Ron. We're here to have a great conversation with our very famous guest. Well, at least he's famous to us. And he's a best-selling author. He's an independent researcher of ancient systems of knowledge and alternative history, which is one of my favorites. You might have seen him on Gaia TV and the History Channel. We have the one and only, yes, Freddy Silva. How you doing?
A very good evening to you in California.
Yes.
How are the fires going?
Well, they're still going.
Yeah, actually.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
They're only
still going.
20% contained in LA.
Yeah, I think almost 200,000 acres right now. So, but luckily where we're at, it's not really affecting us. And but unfortunately, many people around us. So we send out our prayers and thoughts, and hope that gets contained. So yes, and lots of luck. Well, I'm excited because we're going to talk about one of your books because you have several books, and I think we may touch on a few of those. Crop circles.
They're all right up our alley,
yes,
Tony. They got crop circles.
All truth be told.
This is right there.
But first, Templar Nation, and that's one of our favorite topics. And I want to find out a little bit more of the history of the Templars. There's a lot of conspiracy out there of how it got started and who started it, and who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, why is it a secret society, all those questions. And so can you just start from the beginning and talk about the Templars, of who they are and where they got started?
It's kind of funny that a conspiracy is usually based on a complete and utter lack of evidence. And
but
the less evidence there is, the more the conspiracy grows, I've noticed. It actually took me about 15 years to get this project finished.
Wow.
Because I thought it would be a simple project. I was originally just looking into the connection between Templars and my original country of birth, which is actually Portugal. And of course, I sound like just every other Portuguese person, as you can tell. And yes, I have lived in Britain for half of my life. This is why I have this ridiculous accent. But I had no idea that the story was actually much bigger. And it turns out that the first thing you have to do in order to understand the Templars, you first of all have to take them aside from Crusaders, because people get the two confused.
Right.
And I think part of the misjudgment that the Templars have been given over the years is the fact that people confuse them with the Crusaders, who were up to mischief and no good. They were basically a bunch of glory hounds and religious zealots that went to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which in itself is not really quite the full motive. There was an ulterior motive, which was linked to the Pope at the time, who wanted to help out his friend, who happened to be the king living over in Constantinople. And he was having a hard time trying to get rid of the Turks from his territory. So he happened to have used the excuse of liberating the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by sending a large army his way. While that army was actually going through Constantinople, the group of Templars seems to have used that opportunity to go into Jerusalem to find something very, very different. And they were totally not related to the Crusaders at all. They had a specific mission right from the very beginning. And in order to understand them, you really have to understand their main benefactor, who was Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a very interesting fellow who was basically, well, he essentially he didn't really create the Cistercian order of monks. He basically just flourished it, because they were basically so hard up that they were literally falling on their knees, metaphorically and physically. And he had this concept of creating a kind of new heaven on earth, a type of real Christianity, not the thing that the Catholic Church has become. Two very different things.
Right.
And he basically handpicked a lot of the original Templars, which a lot of people don't know. So in order to understand the Templars' motive, you have to understand and get under the skin of Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, I've read 500 of his surviving letters. And I tell you, I think I've really got to know the guy very well, because what he was saying publicly in most cases, and he was a fantastic diplomat, by the way, was one thing, because you couldn't really fight the church and all of their henchmen in Europe at the time. You had to be very careful of what you said. Mm-hmm. And when you read between the lines of what he was saying and what he was actually preaching, he wanted to find a new kingdom of conscience. And he basically set a lot of the Templars with a special mandate to find something very specific on the Temple Mount. Now, the story that we hear is that they became very, very rich because they found tremendous amounts of money on the Temple Mount. That partly is true. Now, you've got to think about this from a different point of view. You have to understand that these Templars, the original Templars, were very rich people to begin with. They gave up all of their money, their power, their wealth, and their position to go 2,000 miles to Jerusalem to dig in very unsavory conditions in tunnels, succumbing to all manner of diseases, in order to then find money to go back to Europe and become rich. I think it would be easier if they'd sat in Europe and just held on to their money and lived happily ever after.
Right.
So no, that wasn't part of the mandate. They did find a treasure hoard of gold, that is certain. But what they were actually looking for was a different kind of treasure. And it's important to understand the origin of the word treasure, which is actually an old Greek word, which is thesauro. And thesauro is not necessarily a treasure of money, but a treasure of words. It's where we get the word thesaurus from. And when you start looking at who was being sent back in 1121 back to Europe with a bunch of scrolls that they had suddenly found under Temple Mount, they took these scrolls to what today is Belgium to be handed to a cryptographer. Now, why would you need a cryptographer to look at scrolls buried under Temple Mount? And who would have put the scrolls there in the first place in such a language that had to be cryptographically deciphered? That's the big secret. And of course, once they've actually figured out the decipherment of these scrolls, you start working your way back 1,000 years earlier to the time when the Romans were actually ransacking Jerusalem. There was a group of guys who essentially, and to all intents and purposes, were dressing like, behaving like, and had the same ethos as the Templars 1,000 years later, and they were called the Essenes. And these were a group of Gnostic Christians who had some very specific beliefs for which they were very hounded. And they knew that the only way for these beliefs to survive into another era was to bury their scrolls along with their treasure under Temple Mount. This is what the Templars, the original Templars, were looking for. They were looking for something very important, information that dealt with something called a living resurrection, which is not what you think it is at all, by the way, and also the ascension of the individual through a specific magical act, which was perpetuated in secret chambers and had been done so for the last 6,000 years. So we're talking about a highly religious, if not mystical, practice that they were looking for in order to actually reanimate an earlier form, a very pure form of Christianity, which is itself very much based on Buddhism and other cultures before that. So from that point of view, you can start looking at the original core group of the Templars and their mission as being very spiritual in nature.
I'm just looking at some of the, as you're talking, I'm pulling up pictures and stuff of some of the past Templars, and I'm curious on the connection between, because even now, Egypt and the Knights Templars, because you said about the living resurrection. I'm really curious about that first, and then we'll talk about Egypt. So what did you mean by they were curious about the living resurrection? Because I'm curious to see what that is all about.
Oh, and it should be. It's one of the most important mystery secrets through which thousands, if not millions of people have been murdered in Europe to try and keep secret. And the church has been behind this all along. It was a book that came after that from the Templars. I began to ask that very same question. And I eventually wrote The Lost Art of Resurrection to basically put to right the misconception that the concept of resurrection was experienced by one guy called Yeshua ben Yosef, otherwise known as Jesus Christ, for which a lot of early Christians were murdered by the church. And I figured, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why would the church be killing its own people? And once I began to look into the Gnostic Gospels, which were banned by the church, and began to realize that these people were also had something in common with other religious sects of the period, who had exactly the same idea about a personal living resurrection, I began to realize that we're dealing with something very, very personal and very secret and very sacred. And it turns out that the living resurrection is actually one of the highest levels of initiation. And it's been practiced for at least 8,000 years, going all the way back to China and the Middle East, and also the Pacific Islands. And to cut a very long story short, essentially, it involved you joining a secret group of people who basically kept themselves aside from ordinary society. And it's really kept secret not because of something nefarious. It was really a secret because the information that they were gathering could be deemed very dangerous to the status quo. And it could also be misused for all kinds of nefarious purposes. That's the only reason why it was secret. And so the initiates would join these secret clubs, to put it mildly, and they would take 3 years out of their lives to be trained into the mystery teachings of civilization, the origin of life, how nature works, and then also to how to work with your electrical systems inside your own body in order to have an out-of-body experience. Now, we're not talking about shamanism here. We're talking about an induced near-death experience, which is the highlight of your initiation after 3 years. And essentially, you were guided into a secret chamber, a restricted room, right. And you took a narcotic in order to lower your heartbeat down to a point where you'd be comatose. And someone would look after you for as many, between 3 and 7 days while your soul left the body. You went walkabout in the other world, completely as real as you are looking at me right now. I mean, absolutely real, compared to shamanism, which is an induced visionary state. And they basically came back into their living body. And at that point, they were declared risen from the dead. And that concept is heard of in China in 3000 BC. So this is a very mystical experience where people had gained insights in another level of reality, another dimension, and they came back to live the tale. One of the practitioners was Plato, and he said that the experience not only shaped his metaphysical doctrine, it was also the highest spiritual development he could possibly ever had hoped to experience. So this is where the Templars suddenly come in. We have a time in the 12th century in Europe where everything is morally bankrupt. We have a culture that's based on plunder. You have to understand that this is a really, really difficult period of time for people to be living in. And so they were looking for something much more spiritual, something that they could practice, go within themselves and discover why they were here and how they could actually continue living on Earth to a degree of self-control. In other words, something that would, a mechanism that would help their manifestation process, that will help them live life absolutely awake and aware. So this is why the Freemasons, who were the progeny of the Templar today, still maintain a vestige of what the Templars were doing. And I know this is getting a little confusing, but stay with me.
I'm here.
When the Templars were hounded almost to death, they escaped to 2 parts of the world. One was Portugal, one was Scotland, and they created Scottish Rite Freemasonry in 1313. So it's actually 400 years older than we're told. And Freemasonry is essentially an extension of the Templars. They literally just changed their name as a method of, a PR exercise so that the church wouldn't go after them again. And if you look at their 3rd degree, it actually to this very day involves a ritual where the candidate is lying down on a figurative grave, and he or she is then lifted up, the blindfold is released, and at that point they're declared risen from the dead. So today we still see an echo of what the Templars were practicing for real inside hidden chambers, which was something that they were practicing that was being done around the world for thousands of years earlier, and it was one of the most secret and sacred practices you could possibly achieve. This is why essentially the church was after them. They wanted also to experience the same degree of control, but they wanted to make sure that the ordinary people didn't have any use of this information, because remember, the church is a middleman.
Right.
It needs to have a job. Therefore, if you have a personal experience of God or another dimension, well, what do we need these guys for? And that literally is the crux of the matter, and this is the reason why the Templars were pretty much hounded.
Hey, Freddie, it sounds very much like, other than the rising from the dead part, it sounds a lot like an ayahuasca experience, doesn't it seem like that?
That's what I was going to ask, too.
It seems like it's almost the same thing. You go to another world, you see other people, everybody has a similar experience. Is this tie into that at all? Do you know?
It's related. That's what I asked the question as well. It's a fair question. And from my journeys with the shaman in South America and Central America, I posed the question and they said, well, actually, no, it's very different.
Oh.
Shamanism is a state where you actually use drugs to induce visionary states, which then allow you to have a certain travel within a level of reality and gain visions, which then you have to process for yourself. What they're doing here with the living resurrection was an actual induced near-death experience. Very, very different thing.
Is it similar to NDEs today?
I'm sorry?
You know, we have a lot of people today that say they have a near-death experience. Is this similar to what people?
It's very, very similar,
Wow.
yes, except the near-death experiences, it's not induced. I mean, you don't know when you're going to get one, and
Right.
hopefully I won't have one while we're on air. But no, this was actually induced. It was deliberately judged. It was a very, very delicate matter because it basically had adepts and shaman who knew how to work with the body's electrical circuits and give you a certain poison whereby you literally were almost comatose, but not enough so that when your soul came back into the body, you'd have a body to come back to. That's the difference between shamanism and the living resurrection experience. One was induced visionary state, the other one was you literally in another level of reality, just without your body.
I'm curious also, because I interview many near-death experienced people. And almost every single one of them, even including my grandfather, came back changed people.
Absolutely.
They either are more intuitive, the more sensitive. They're more just appreciative of life. Did you, in any of your readings, was there anybody that talked about their experience of changing their view on life and any intuitive or psychic abilities after the effect?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it was actually one of the first things that you taught was never to reveal what you'd experienced on
Really?
in the other world, because the idea was that it's a personal journey.
Okay.
So for me, for example, to say to you, for the last 3 days, you have no idea where I've been,
Right.
and this is what I experienced. So you would then go through the same experience and expect to experience what I had done.
Right.
But that wouldn't do any good to you because you're not me, and my reason for being here is very different to yours. That's why they kept it very,
sense.
very secret. But to answer your question directly, yes, they did say that essentially it shaped their spiritual doctrine. It helped them see the world with very different eyes, and they came back much more aware and awake. That's why they were called risen from the dead, because it was a bit of a joke, actually, because they reasoned that people who haven't had the pleasure of this experience, they walk around life as though dead. They have a birth, they have a difficult life, and then they die, and they have no idea why they're here.
Right.
Where you, by comparison, are awake. You are risen from the dead because you actually have had the pleasure of seeing the world as it really is, the truth of how things really are created. And to a certain degree, you have control over the manifestation process because you now know how nature actually works. If you can do that, you're already ahead of 50% of the people. In fact, in Hindu culture today, they actually still perform some of these rituals,
Really?
and they actually refer to the unenlightened people as corpses.
Huh.
So for them, this conversation would be a matter-of-fact conversation in a cafe every single day. It was a very different experience of shamanism, which anybody can really do. You just have to go somewhere special and hang out with someone who really understands what they're doing. But with near-death experience, it requires total commitment for several years. And also the experience was very, very painful to the point where, there were some people, actually, no, to quote a very famous story in the Bible, Lazarus, who, as you probably remember, Jesus is awoke in the middle of the night because Lazarus is going through the living resurrection experience and he panics. He actually finds himself, having fear in control of him, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to be in control of your fear by that time. He actually got into the whole fear concept and he panicked and he finds himself inside a sarcophagus and of course he's trapped. So they come and get Jesus, and Jesus has to basically go and literally just get Lazarus back from the dead. But the whole thing was a metaphor. It was taken out of context. And this is what really riled the Gnostic Christians in that era. They were saying that the church is taking all of these sacred understandings and they're saying that these things are literal. but they're not literal. They're all metaphors. And unless you understand the inner teachings, you won't understand what the metaphor is. And there's the confusion between the two camps.
Do you think that because of this process, the living resurrection, that because I've interviewed Templars before, or at least Freemasons, and they were saying that they don't care for like one religion, like so it's more of a spiritual journey. So when they did this separation kind of from the church, renamed themselves, and also the practice of living resurrection, so they've become more of a spiritual group and not a religious group. Am I correct?
Absolutely. In fact, none of these people ever put any stock in religion. This is really a modern construct. It's about the faith of the individual. Every single faith that was around at the time of Jesus and before that was claiming that the experience of God is internal, because you are God. We're all gods. We're all an expression of that entity that we call the Creator. So how can you possibly be separate from it? It's just not possible. Even the Egyptians understood this concept of having a one-to-one relationship with the creative source, because you are a drop of that source. To have an intermediary, it was ridiculous to them. So this is where the religious concept comes in. You have this intermediary that tells you that you have to talk to them and pay them money, usually, for them to talk to God on your behalf. Which is absolute nonsense. Anybody can talk to God. In fact, I can sit here right now and have a conversation with it, in my own mind. It's not that far away. So their idea was faith is a very personal thing, because they understood that we're here on a personal journey. Each one of us has come here with an individual mandate. And the more tools that you have at your disposal to figure out why you're here, the more aware you are of your purpose. And therefore, you can make the best use of the limited time you have in the physical body. Essentially, that's what it comes down to, is trying to be much more aware of your surroundings, much more aware of the tools that you have at your disposal, and recognize that you are a very powerful being. This is all very New Age stuff, and yet it's also paradoxically extremely ancient teachings, which go back, thousands upon thousands of years. I found some of the earliest writings with the Zoroastrian culture, which go back to 6000 BC. They're talking about exactly the same stuff. You have the people that don't care or don't really get it, and that's fine. But then you have the few that say, well, wait a minute, what tools can I possibly gain in order to have a deeper insight of what makes me tick? Who am I? What is the purpose of life? What's the bigger question at work here? And they basically figured it out by either putting people in unusual rooms, secret chambers, pyramids, or sacred places where the laws of physics are slightly different, where you and I can just go and sit somewhere and have the same experience. In Native American culture, again, this is all matter of fact. If you go to New Mexico today and you go and hang out at certain power spots, you'll find, if you have the money to hire very specialized equipment, you find that these power spots are actually geomagnetic anomalies, or serious electromagnetic gravitational hotspots. And under the right conditions, if you just allow yourself to be silent in these spots, you can have an out-of-body experience. And again, it's not shamanism. This in a very controlled environment. And I always use the metaphor of kind of like driving your car. The more you do it, the better you get at it. Then it becomes second nature. You can actually go to one of these sites, sit there, and come back a completely changed person, because you've had an actual inkling of what it's really like in the bigger picture of things. And once you've connected with that matrix, your life is really not the same.
And now it makes sense that Freemasons and then Templars, and I'm curious, did the Templars look at Egypt and their spirituality as much as the Freemasons do now? Because, I mean, you look at Washington, D.C., most of them were Freemasons. A lot of the symbols are from, based off Egypt. Were they that enthralled with Egypt back in the Templar days?
Oh, absolutely, and much more than Egypt. There are cultures which are even older. We're talking about the Scythian culture, which actually comes from the Black Sea, the Carpathian region, where we get the story of Dracula from, and the concept of a bloodline, and he following the concept of looking for his divine bride. I mean, Dracula is a highly fictionalized version of the protection of a divine bloodline and the journey of the initiate, kind of like Osiris meeting Isis. It's just wrapped up in a horror story. They actually were following traditions which are very, very ancient. In fact, and in fact, to put things in clarity, there are two branches of Freemasonry at work here. We have the London Rite, which is what most people consider to be the Orthodox Masonry, which started in London in in the 18th century. But the original Freemasonry actually began technically in Scotland with the Scottish Rite Freemasons, which are actually, if you speak to them, they'll say they're very, very different from the London Rite, and indeed they are. The London Rite is what people tend to associate with, for example, old boys networks and business deals and shady handshakes and things like that. They don't even understand what they're doing or what they're saying in these rituals. It's just an excuse to dress up. And I had this on fact from people who are themselves part of that London Rite. They ended up writing some of the best books on inside stories of the Freemasonry movement, and recognizing that Scottish Rite Freemasonry actually today has essentially a mirror image of what the Templars were doing. They just don't do the physical part of the raising the dead ceremony, because a lawyer today will jump all over that. You don't want to induce a near-death experience because your client might die.
Right.
So we have these protocols today which get in the way, unfortunately. But yeah, if you basically look at what Scottish Rite Freemasonry promotes and what it says, it's a highly spiritual tradition. It's open to men and women. And yes, you'll find a lot of this information that goes back to the early book of Enoch in the Bible. They actually traced their origins back to then. And if Enoch was discussing a time when he was warned about a great big flood, which we can now date at 9,703 BC to geological record, well, how old is this information? How old is this knowledge? And how long has these secret groups been going on? That's the big question.
Wow, man, that
this is pretty. This is great stuff. I love this stuff, and
that's why it takes 15 years to write a book.
I was going to say, I can see why, because that's a lot of research to go through. I mean, because that's thousands of years of going through, a lot of text and just, pretty much anything you can get your hands on.
This death part's the most exciting part.
From different points of view. It's like. The way I work is I don't really have a particular idea or notion I want to promote. I just basically read something that interests me, and I say, well, that's kind of interesting. How did that come about? And just let the facts take you where they go. And sometimes it does require looking from multiple points of view, not just from your own. Otherwise, it's just my opinion, and that's no good to you. And the more opinions you kind of approach and you begin to see a bigger picture, then you begin to see outside of the actual story, and that's when it gets really exciting, because then you actually are part of that history. You become part of essentially getting under the skin of the people that create this information, and hopefully, and I mean hopefully, you get to the core of the truth, because we're just digging around in the rubbish heap of history, aren't we, as researchers? We're trying to figure out bits and pieces of kernels of information, hopefully sticking together the things that make sense and coming up with a plausible story. And again, that takes time. It takes deep research.
That near-death stuff, I hadn't even heard that.
That's the first time I've ever heard.
It's a shame if they don't do that, because that's the part that they should continue to do and should continue to pursue, and we should try to learn from, right? That's the exciting part.
Well, I've interviewed a Freemason before, and he wrote a book about the Knights of the Templar, and he didn't even bring this up, and I'm surprised, because that's really
I wonder if way up
an
there
important
they do
part. I mean, that's an important part of what.
Sure.
Yeah, the history. And how did they even survive? How did the Knights Templar survive with them? Pretty much becoming spiritual and doing this practice of living resurrection. How did the Catholic Church and any other church even allow them to stay alive?
Oh, it took them a while to cotton on to what was going on. I remember Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a spokesman for the Templars.
Right.
He was a cunning little fellow. I mean, he really knew diplomacy, had to say one thing and practice something else behind curtains. And that was what was going on. And with particular bent to the work that I was doing with First Templar Nation, that's what got me excited about this story, because I thought, okay, you can't do anything in Europe without the church knowing. So why would a group of people from Northern Europe, essentially 11 guys, how what attracted them to go to Jerusalem in the first place.
Right.
And then around about 1121 to 1125, they suddenly began to leave in a hurry, and they began to create Europe's first nation state, which of course is Portugal.
Right.
And that's why I thought was kind of interesting, because you can't get any further away from Europe in that era than in Portugal. You can go about doing whatever you want. And also, you can do it because in Portugal at the time, they just paid lip service to the Pope. They didn't really give a damn about the church. They were pagans. They were Celts. They had a long history of people doing whatever they were damn well pleased.
Right.
And so they were real punks at the era. And so the Templars go to this part of the world. They create a country from scratch. They put one of their own guys on the throne to be the first king of Portugal, which I'm amazed people in Portugal don't even know this. I found this in a 16th century book written by monks, written on animal skin. That's what it comes down to. So they were able to go about practicing the living resurrection ritual and other things. They were practicing a lot of good deeds for the public. Essentially, this is why the people loved them. This is why they were universally revered, and they were given a lot of money because they gave protection. They would house the poor. They would feed the hungry. They would provide a kind of a welfare system for people who really needed a net. They gave houses to the elderly, and they basically provided education and also taught people about agriculture and how to maintain themselves and feed themselves. In the middle of Europe, in the Middle Ages, this was like honey coming from heaven, because the church was basically killing everybody left, right, and center unless they agreed with them.
Right.
And then they would steal what little you didn't have. The Templars were saying, well, no, if you give us a little bit, we'll take that little bit, we'll multiply it, and we'll protect it, and we'll create these wonderful societies, these wonderful utopias. And they really did succeed in many areas around France, and especially in Portugal. And so it took the church a while to figure out that this was actually going on. By the time they finally figured out the scoop, and this is now we're getting into the middle area of the temple, where the order was growing so fast at such a rapid speed that the usual checks and balances fell by the wayside. So you had a lot of nefarious people joining the Templars to find out what was going in. So there was a lot of plants being put in there, and they began to report back to the church that again, erroneously, because the people on the outside of the brotherhood didn't really know what was happening in the inner brotherhood, because there was a point to this. Certain things had to be kept quite secret. And they kept saying that the Templars were performing secret rituals where they would conjure a devil called Baphomet, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, any Arab person, when they hear the word Baphomet, will say, well, actually, that's Abafohileme. That means the source of wisdom, or the father of wisdom, which to the Templars in the inner order was, of course, John the Baptist. And the only thing they ever cared about was the mummified head of John the Baptist. They didn't follow Jesus. They didn't give a damn about the church. It was John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene who they really cared about. This is why they dedicated all their church to those two people. So you find out what these two people stood for, and that starts to tell you what the Templars really were protecting. So by the time the Pope shows up and goes, okay, I want in on this, we're missing out on something very important, because people are becoming very spiritual without our blessing. This cannot happen. At the same time, Philip of France also wanted to be a Templar, and of course, he's as bent as a $15 note. So they said, no, we're not letting you in. You're an idiot, and you're going to use this stuff for nefarious purposes. So they said bye-bye. So Philip got a little bee under his bonnet, and he basically conjured all of these nonsensical terms that the Templars were up to. So this gets back to the Pope, and the Pope says, right, we're going to accuse him of heresy, blah, blah, blah. And they sent a letter across Europe and especially to Spain to wipe them all out. Well, when the letter gets to Portugal, little did they know that the King of Portugal at the time, in the 14th century, was himself a Templar knight. Kept this very quiet, and he wrote a letter back saying, "Well, no, we've taken the Templars to court, and we found that they've done absolutely nothing wrong." Well, surprise, surprise, they hadn't done anything wrong, and the king was not going to imprison his own people anyway. So the Pope really became very insistent at this point. So what follows next is probably history's biggest practical joke. that a king of Portugal, Dom Diniz, gathers all the Templars in his court and says, right, here's the problem. We got the church breathing down our neck. We got Philip of France also breathing down our neck. The Spanish are in on this with the Pope, and we can't fight all of those people. We don't have the manpower, nor do we want to. We've got a good thing going here, and we want to keep it quiet. So here's what we're going to do. Give me all your lands and all your money. I will hold them, and you go away for 5 years and have a vacation in the Algarve. Beautiful women, lovely fish, get a suntan. Relax, and I'll see you in 5 years. And the Templars went to the Algarve. They disappeared. So the king wrote a letter to the Pope and says, Your Eminence, you'd be glad to know that the Order of the Temple no longer exists. But coincidentally, we have just come up with a brand new group of knights who are now calling themselves the Order of the Knights of the Temple of Jesus and the Church of Jerusalem, which of course was wonderful news to the Pope, because they thought, knights worshipping Jesus, that's a good, very Christian thing, you've got my blessing. The Templars come back from their vacation, talk to the king, and he says, okay, here's your money, here's your land back, and from now on, you are no longer to be called Knights Templar. You are now to be called the Knights of the Order of Christ. Savvy? And they went, absolutely, and they went on getting on with their business, which was working with the Scottish Templars, which had become the Freemasons, and together they were doing a lot of trips to a place called Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Right. The rest, as you know, is American history.
Awesome.
Okay, but that's the part we want to know about. So did they go get a quote-unquote treasure? Was there a grail that these guys found, do you think? And or do you think it was a not a physical object?
Are you talking about Oak Island, by any chance?
Oh, well, that was my second question. Was going to be
We'll do the first one.
Let's do the first one, which is what is the Holy Grail? Is that related to the Templars? Is it a symbol?
Yeah, absolutely. It does precede the Templars by 4,000 years, unfortunately. I asked the same question. I didn't want to go there. When you mentioned, we bring up the Grail, it's kind of like bringing up Atlantis. Right. No one wants to talk to you anymore, or a few people do, and they don't make very interesting dinners either. Right. So I figured, let me look at this from a different point of view. What really is the Grail about? Because it's been described as a physical object, a woman, a womb, a bloodline, a spiritual concept, a tray, and I'm going, none of these have any connection, whether we start. So again, you have to dig very deep. You have to do a lot of work. And it turns out that when you keep going further back in history, the Grail actually appears in the Song of Inanna, there you go, which is a Sumerian script that goes back to about 3,000 BC or thereabouts. And that's where you get the mention of the Graal, which is actually describing in symbolic terms a cup, in symbolic terms, not in real terms. And it's a cup that holds a divine bloodline. And this bloodline essentially is the union between the descent of certain gods a long time ago who intermarried with human women in order to perpetuate a divine bloodline. Essentially, a group of people who were very spiritual, very psychic. Some of them were healers. They were prominent leaders. Architects, people who really were the pinnacle of society and did things for the right reasons for the good of the people. What an incredible idea that is today. And this holy bloodline eventually fused all the way from Sumeria to the Egyptian bloodline, which eventually also married with the Scythian bloodline. Wow. And eventually it went all the way to Scotland and created the Holy Blood of Scotland. But that's another story. In the middle of this story is Mary Magdalene, who was very much part of that bloodline tradition for two reasons. One, she came from a specific family that was tied to John the Baptist, who was himself part of that bloodline. And two, she was called a hierodule. Basically, that's a very ancient term, which goes back to Sumeria, which describes a priestess with the highest clearance of in the secret part of the temple. And their purpose was the highest level of initiation was to guide the initiate in a place called the bridal chamber, where the initiate was taken in a comatose state out of body traveled to the other world, came back 3 days later, and the priestesses were in charge of making sure that they survived the ordeal. They knew about herbs and drugs and poisons and how to administer them. So when Mary Magdalene is basically at the foot of the cross giving this vinegar to Jesus, that's exactly what was going on. He actually did not die on the cross. He was never nailed to a cross. And a lot of the early Christians, including the Apostle Thomas and Philip, they claimed as much in their Gospels, which of course banned by the church. They said the whole resurrection and the crucifixion were metaphors. They never actually took place.
Wow.
There was a mock crucifixion that took place on Joseph of Arimathea's land. I'm now paraphrasing someone else's research, a man who I respect a great deal. Michael Bagent, the late Michael Bagent, who co-wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So he comes from that background. He does his research very well. And he basically concluded that Mary Magdalene was also the first person who was evidence at Jesus' miraculous resurrection in the tomb, whereas the church claims it was Peter, because, of course, it had to be a guy.
Right.
Because we have a patriarchal hierarchy going on here. So Mary Magdalene, of course, knows the poison and that she's given him on the cross, because Jesus was actually tied to a cross a quarter of a mile away from the nearest eyewitness. And basically, and I hope I'm paraphrasing his work correctly, I'm sure I am, and she basically administers the antidote, and Jesus gets up. He goes walkabout to the Middle East, dies in India, apparently at the old age of 80. Mary Magdalene, who was pregnant and had 3 children, one of whom was named Tamara, which is the name of the town the center of activity of the Templars in Portugal to this very day. The most famous of their temples are in Tamara in Portugal. She basically goes walkabout and ends up in France and then disappears from view. Why? Because the church was after the bloodline. So the best way to keep it secret is split the parents up and keep them separate, so one of them is going to survive. Wow. So we're talking about, a very, very long story spanning a lot of traditions here. But basically, it was all being kept secret because the benefits eventually would trickle down to the population in a very positive way.
Where is this information that you're getting coming from?
It's coming from various sources. One of them is a Song of Inanna, which mentions the Grail for the first time. Secondly, it's the work of Michael Bagent and Leon Lincoln, who wrote the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, who helped me really get an understanding that the Grail really wasn't a physical object per se. If you basically take Mary Magdalene as a physical object, yes, actually it is a physical object. And yes, it actually is a womb as well, because it's from her womb and people like her that the divine bloodline keeps basically reappearing throughout history, and none more so than the Merovingian bloodline, which appeared and was very central, dominant in central France, until the church backed the Carolingians, who then disenfranchised the Merovingians and they basically assassinated all of them. And the Merovingians went underground, and they're probably still alive today. So it's little snippets of information from different people and different sects that helps you frame a bigger picture of what's really going on. And also, for example, the original Grail legends in the 12th century. When you start reading the original stories that Chrétien de Troyes wrote, you find that a lot of the main people associated with the original Templar Brotherhood came from Troyes in France. This is not by accident. And at the same time that Chrétien is writing his version of the Grail, because it's a very old adaptation of the Arthurian legend. It's an adaptation of the legend of Osiris and Isis, Jason and the Argonauts. This is the same story that keeps getting repackaged for a different audience in a different period. So the Grail story is nothing new. It's thousands of years old. It just needs to get retold in a different way to appeal to a different audience. Kind of like Star Wars is the Grail story of today, believe it or not, because it's really about the redemption of Darth Vader. It's about the initiate who is in the light, is seduced by the dark, comes back, and eventually marries his divine bride. He literally is risen from the dead. So again, the story gets repackaged. So the Grail essentially is all of those things wrapped into one.
Tony, we need 12 hours with this gentleman.
I know. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we're going to have to invite you back because you have more.
We're out of time already?
Yeah, we have
Coming up on the hour.
We have another show starting at 6 o'clock, so we have to.
Oh, yeah,
I know.
Is he going to tell us what's buried at Oak Island, or is he going to?
Oh yeah, let's do it. What do you think about Oak Island? What do you think? We'll have to have you back because we want to talk about crop circles and many other things. So, but what do you think about the Oak Island location?
I think they're making a terrible hash of it on the History Channel, for one thing. It's disgraceful what they've been allowed to get away with. And secondly, they won't find it because the sea level has risen since the time it was built. And you have to live here like I do in the Gulf of Maine to understand sea level. It's not going up by inches, it's gone up by feet in this part of the world over the last 400 years. They'll never be able to find it, and we don't know what it is. It's a big mystery. I was a bit compelled to sort of get involved when a friend of mine said, "You really got to watch this program," and I did, and I was so bored out of my mind, it was ridiculous. And then they were looking at these white boulders, and I said, "Those boulders look like the constellation of the Swan, which is a very old symbol of initiation and secret mysteries." And I thought the Templars and the Masons were kind of involved with that, with this image of the Swan at one point. And I bet if you follow those boulders and go where the neck of the Swan is, you'll find another entrance, a back entrance to that. And a few episodes later, lo and behold, as if someone was, tapping my mind, they actually went and actually followed that concept, and they actually dug in the bay and actually found the second entrance, which of course is waterlogged and they can't get in. So I don't know, but I do know that the Templars and the Portuguese Templars were certainly there way, way before Columbus even knew what America was.
So you do think the Templars were there? You do think that they went to?
Yes, absolutely. And that there is a map that I found at Harvard University, which actually shows a map of Labrador and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland with the Portuguese royal flag, which is at least 50 years on that map before Columbus ever showed up. So they definitely knew what was going on. And when Columbus was in Lisbon hoping to get some information about how to get to the New World, they gave him the wrong information because the Portuguese had been going back and forth to America for centuries. I mean, they were master seafarers because they were partly Phoenician, and the Phoenicians also had already been in the Azores 2,500 years ago at least. So they knew that there was a big continent there because of all the stories that were told by people like Plato that was saying, yeah, at one point there was a huge continent before you got to the next continent, which was called Atlantis. And they were basically going backwards and forwards. So they gave the wrong information to Columbus. In the meantime, the Templars have been going there for at least 300 years because they were using the same captains in Genoa that were also the same people that were helping the Templars in Scotland. So, and the Portuguese and the Scottish have always been working together for as long as anyone's known. It's like they're like brotherhoods in terms of cultures.
Wow. Tony, how can we add time? I think we're out of
I wish we could add time, but we're going to have you back. So please, where do people find you, follow you, all that good stuff?
Oh, well, don't follow me. Follow yourself.
Don't peek in the windows. Don't,
Invisibletemple.com is my website. So books, DVDs, interviews, articles, just have fun. You'll be there until Christmas. Maybe later.
I know I'm going to get stuck there.
Right? Well, this is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet, Captain Ron. We want you guys to go to our YouTube channel, subscribe, leave comments. Let us know who you have on the show. Want us to have on the show. They're like people like this. This is just
this is great.
This is what Truth Be Told is all about. So go to truthbetoldwebtv.com, subscribe to our newsletter. We really appreciate you guys. That without you guys, we wouldn't have a show. And all of our sponsors, thank you so much. Until next week, we'll be back with some more interesting people, and I know you guys hopefully will enjoy it. So don't go anywhere, and check us out next time right here on Truth Be Told.
Thanks again, Freddie.
Thank you.
Freddie, don't go anywhere. Hold on.